In the academic study of religion, or in the academic study of the history of a religion, or history that is very connected to a specific religion, defining a religion, defining a specific religious tradition has a lot of problems associated with it. In fact, you could even argue that you ought not to define a religion, since if you do it as an outsider of that religious tradition, it is associated with a lot of issues related to power relations and defining other groups that might need to be considered, as you might carry biases that affect your definitions, and how you define another group might have major implications for the results of your study of that group and how you interpret things related to that group. Yet, if you are an insider of a religious tradition, there are also still problems with you defining your own religious tradition, since this can be connected to issues of sectarianism and defining other groups within a religious tradition as not being part of the religious tradition in a way that is more based upon sectarian preferences than it is upon an ideal of studying a religion in an academic sense, which can lead to distortions in the understanding of a religious tradition that has a multitude of groups within it. And just like in the case of an outsider defining a religious tradition, in a way that practically functions as an attack against that religious tradition and its believers, rather than as a legitimate tool of analysis of that religious tradition. An insider defining their own religious tradition can function as an attack on other groups by more or less stating that they are not of that religious tradition. They are not legitimate believers of that tradition, by using a definition that excludes them, or that implies that they are not practicing the religion correctly. And I can admit that there are a lot of potential pitfalls that you can fall into when studying religion, as an object of study for general knowledge, rather than as something you study in order to practice yourself. Though the lines here can be blurred somewhat between study for general knowledge and study of religion for self-practice in certain cases, though I will skip over these edge cases. In any case, I still think that definitions are needed when studying something, religion included, because a definition is needed in order to define what you're studying and what to focus upon when you study something. And if you define a religious tradition too broadly, you have a risk of a broadness problem and a lack of coherence and limitation upon what you're studying in a religious tradition, as suddenly everything falls under that broad definition of a religious tradition or religious aspect. Even things that you could argue quite clearly ought not to be included in that religious tradition or definition of religious phenomena within that tradition. So defining something too broadly has its own issues, as a definition that includes everything defines nothing, and you might include too much contradictory elements within a definition that make it hard to define whatever you are studying. And furthermore, if you have a very broad definition of what you are studying, it can also be hard for you to focus upon something and limit your research onto the thing that you really want to focus upon when you are studying a religion. You need to limit your research parameters and make it more focused, since an object of study can't get too big, or you will never ever finish studying that object, or get useful, coherent information and knowledge about that object of study. Now, neither should you define a religious tradition too narrowly either, depending upon what you're studying and which aspect you're studying. If you are explicitly focusing upon a very strictly defined group, area, aspect of that group, and or a certain point of time in that group's history, then a more strict, narrower definition can be motivated. But that is just it. You need always to have a motivation for why you are defining a religious tradition or a religious aspect of a religious tradition like that. When you're arguing about definitions and using definitions in your study of a religion. And there are risks in defining a religion too narrowly or in a too defined way in one direction or the other, even when you self-identify as a believer of that religious tradition.
Because there is the risk of missing the fact
that many religious traditions and religious groups are not entirely coherent, and there are several contradictory concepts within many religions, and even within the same supposed subgroups within these religions. There can exist contradictions or matters of debate and interpretation that might differ among the believers even within a certain subgroup of a larger religious tradition. And this does not even go into the differences that can exist between officially self-identified different subgroups within a religion. And many of these differences in practice, in opinion, in interpretation can sometimes be ignored to the detriment of one wanting to study a religion in order to reach greater knowledge about that religious tradition. Just because oneself defined the religion too narrowly according to one's own definition of one's own beliefs, rather than considering the fact about how this definition, based upon one's own religious experience, might limit one's own ability for greater understanding of a religion in a greater context, as a greater phenomena that includes a lot of contradictory beliefs and practices among the believers. And even if you're an outsider doing a study based upon the self-identification of the believers, where you're studying certain believers according to their own self-identification, you are simply defining a religious believer of a tradition by their own self-identification of belonging to that religious tradition. You still have issues of things not being coherent, and you will meet several contradictory beliefs and concepts within that tradition, within this supposedly easily defined group that you're studying many times. And regardless if you're an outsider or an insider defining a religion, you always must be aware of the fact that when you define a religion, there is always the risk of promoting sectarianism when you contrast what you study to this definitional ideal of a religion that you have defined for your study. And I am of the view that you ought to avoid being partial in your study of a religion. Rather, you ought to only try to be analytical and descriptive in your study of a religious tradition, as far as that is possible, and to avoid definitions that can be prescriptive, that risk creating an ideal religion that the believers are supposed to live up to, rather than a definition that describes a religion or a segment of a religion. As someone that studies religion, you ought to mold your definitions according to what you notice in that religion, rather than let your definition mold the religion or define the religion. Though of course you still need to have considerations about the size and scope of the study that you're doing with regards to a religion. And sometimes you need a stricter definition in order to limit what you are studying. And depending upon the questions that you want answered through a study of a religion, you might also need a definition that requires a certain level of coherency in the subject matter that you are studying, in the material that you are studying. And thus, you define religion in such a way that you enforce this sort of coherency of definition onto the material you're studying, and you disregard other contradictory elements, because that is not part of what you want to focus upon. But you still need to be aware of the fact that you're doing this, and you need to consider, what is this definition I have of what I'm studying limiting myself to? What can it potentially make me blind to? And what is the benefit of actually having this definition? Can it make things clearer? Can it answer the questions that I have in a way that a broader definition cannot? And what can this definition, if applied in other contexts, lead to as well? What are the implications of this definition that I've chosen regarding this tradition of religion, or this sub-tradition of religion, or this aspect of religion? Am I choosing this definition due to the benefits that this definition can bring in terms of research, study, and understanding? Or have I chosen this definition due to some sort of bias or misunderstanding on my part about this religion, or some sort of blind spot I have regarding it? Could another definition of this religion, or this sub-tradition of religion, or aspect of religion, be better than the one I currently have? Discussing religion and discussing what a certain religion is, discussing the limitations and benefits of a definition, and having a self-discussion with yourself when studying religion is important in order to better your own understanding about what you're studying, and to get a deeper understanding of the object of study that you're studying. And you need to always be self-aware that even if your definitions are implicit rather than outright stated when you study a religion, you still have definitions of certain religions that you use in order to define the objects of study. Because you can't study something without at least some definitions about the objects that you are studying. Yet, it is also still important that these definitions are not too strict, nor too partial in any one direction, or biased in some other way, nor too broad to function as a useful definition to use when you study a religion. And studying a religion requires a lot of self-awareness and self-contemplation about how you define others and how you define yourself in relation to the religion that you are studying. And if your definitions about a religion, or even about your own religious views, are actually beneficial in order to reach greater knowledge, or if they can even be outright a hindrance to get knowledge, or even worse, something that outright distorts knowledge, and in the worst case, actually make you spread ignorance rather than a deeper understanding about another religion or your own religious tradition. And usually when I work with definitions of religion, I pose a couple of questions towards these definitions. Firstly, is this definition useful in answering a question which you want to get answered through your study? Secondly, is it useful in limiting the object of study into something manageable? Thirdly, what is lost with this definition? What are you not studying if you have this definition? Fourthly, can you miss something that is actually important to answer the question that you seek to be answered? And is it possible that the definition is actually distorting the knowledge process and your ability to actually answer the question that you seek the answer to? And here you also need to consider the question itself, if it actually imposes limitations or definitions upon the object of study in such a way that it automatically creates distorted knowledge. And then you have the fifth question. What are the consequences or greater implications of having this sort of definition also outside of this specific study? Can having this definition work outside of this study? If it can, then it might be a very good definition because it might be useful for further future studies. But even if it can't be used outside of this specific study, it might be useful to answer this specific question and still be motivated to have it for this specific study of this very specifically defined area of study with regards to a religion. Yet, you also need to consider, does this definition lead to contradictions with other definitions in other studies and on a greater scale of the religion, in a greater context of the religion? Because sometimes a definition that might work in a very strictly defined subsection of a religion might not work for the greater religion and might actually be problematic to even adopt for this subsection of the religion due to various contextual reasons and due to the fact that it can lead to absurdities later down the line if you begin to actually consider what the knowledge that this definition produces actually leads to due to this definition. Sometimes these contradictions and absurdities can actually be motivated because you are dealing with a subgroup of a greater religious tradition that is very different from various other subgroups in this aspect that you're studying. Though sometimes, even if that group does have this difference, changing the definition for this subgroup specifically can cause issues when you later want to do comparisons with the greater religious tradition. And then you might need to change definitions or modify your previous studies in order to make better comparisons. You need to consider the consequences and implications of the definitions you have for a specific study in a greater context. And lastly is a question that you should pose to yourself. Why did you choose to have this definition? Because ultimately, you are the one that actually define what you study. Did you choose this definition because you have certain biases or preferences? And could these preferences or biases actually distort what you're studying? And it ought to be said here that these biases need not only be your own religious convictions. It could also be the fact that you are used to having a certain kind of definition of something, or you have argued in the past passionately for a certain definition, and letting that definition be changed or letting go of that definition in favor of some other new definition of a religion or religious aspect can be hard to do because of previous habit in defining something like that, and due to pride and emotional attachment to a certain definition. 2. When contemplating this question with regards to a religious tradition or religious aspect, you need to be very honest with yourself and try to be as self-aware as you can be about yourself. Ask yourself, what are my preferences and how could these possibly distort what I am trying to study? Am I actually having this definition due to the fact that this definition is useful for me to get knowledge, or do I have this definition due to some sort of other reason or agenda, which might distort my own understanding of the world? You need to do this sort of self-contemplation when trying to define a religion, or a religious subgroup, or aspect. Anyway, these are the 6 questions that I think you should think about when you are making a definition about a religion, a religious tradition, a religious subgroup, or a religious aspect. Or anything to do with religion, generally. And in many other subjects outside of the study of religion, too. And when you are contemplating these questions regarding definitions, try also to motivate having these definitions with regards to these questions. But also try to find motivations about why a definition does not work, or why there are issues with a certain definition. Because there is almost always never a definition that is perfect. Almost all definitions will have imperfections in how they define a religion. Actually, I would even go so far as to say that if you think that your definition of a religion is perfect, then you are most likely wrong, and you are simply blind to the imperfections of that definition. Blind to the issues of that definition in terms of what it overlooks or how it could potentially distort your knowledge. Yet, having an imperfect stated definition that you have considered the issues with is still better than having no clear definition or no definition that you have considered the issues around. Studying and getting knowledge is often not a perfect process, but it is better to try to do it imperfectly rather than not doing it at all, or doing it without any sort of awareness of potential pitfalls when you are studying a religion. Because without the awareness of the limitations of your own definitions, you will not be aware about your own potential limitations about getting good knowledge. But if you are aware of the limitations of your own definitions of a religion, then you can compensate and study that religion using other definitions too, which might broaden your view on the religion and might help you in getting other sorts of knowledge that might be beneficial to you in your journey to greater understanding. And this was a somewhat rambling video about the various problems and issues in defining religion, in defining specific religious traditions, sub-traditions, or religious aspects, or even religion generally. And I hope you liked this video about it. Please ask questions and comment upon this video, and I will try to respond to you as quickly as possible.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.